Good afternoon from the Asia-Europe Foundation in Singapore. My name is Miguel Pangalangan from the ASEM Education Department. I warmly welcome you to the third session of the ARC8, where we will focus on Chapter 1 of the ARC8 Outlook Report 2030. This chapter tackles equitable access and success in higher education. I am pleased to introduce our moderator for today, for this session, Dr. Wesley TETER, who is Senior Consultant at UNESCO's Asia and Pacific Regional Bureau for Education in Bangkok, Thailand. Before I hand over the floor to Dr. TETER, I would like to share with you some more details on the session flow. The first part of our session is public. During the 5-minute health break at the end, the public audience is invited to move to our next session. As for the ASEM policymakers, we will continue with our moderator and experts in an in-depth policy dialogue. This part is a closed-door session. Please do enjoy your interactions, and I will see you again after the public session. Dr. TETER, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Miguel, and Sawadee Krap. Warm greetings from UNESCO Bangkok. It's such a pleasure to be with you and to host this important session on equitable access and success in higher education. We're just thrilled to be with you, especially after that outstanding opening. So energetic, so much passion. This session is key to get the data and information behind the recommendations that we're putting forward, and your voice is key. So the idea for today is we're going to speak for about 20 minutes, but really we want everyone on the ARC8 conference platform to put in their questions. We want everyone on the YouTube live stream to be participating, sharing information, links and ideas. This is really about your views on the data that you're going to be presented with in the next few minutes. So I'm just thrilled to introduce two wonderful speakers, friends and colleagues that I think you're really going to enjoy hearing from. Miss Mary TUPAN-WENNO is the Executive Director of ECHO, the Center for Diversity Policy in the Netherlands. The second speaker is Dr. Wong Chang Da, a good friend of mine and Director of the National Higher Education Research Institute at the Universiti Sains, Malaysia. Chang Da is director, as I mentioned. He focuses on higher education policy and practice, specifically in the Global South, on issues of governance and management, access and equity, student development and curriculum, doctoral education, and the academic profession itself. So we're keen to hear from him and excited to hear about his perspectives. Mary, we're going to start with you. I know you have so much experience. We're thrilled to hear from you. Your 25 years of experience with policy and program development, improving access and success of underrepresented groups in higher education. We know you have a specific focus on ethnic diversity. We know that you've been a founding member of the European Access Network back in 1991. And your work on the Global Access to Post-Secondary Education Initiative continues to this day as a board member of both the EAN and GAPS initiative. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to pass to Mary as our first speaker, and we're in your hands, Mary. We look forward to your contributions, and after that, Chang Da.
Thank you so much, Wesley. And thank you so much for joining this session. Chang Da and I will present some of the outcomes of the first chapter of the Outlook document, and it was not just the work of Chang Da and me, but it is a collaborative work of representatives from Asia and Europe. I would like to go to the so I will do some introductory introductory remarks why this is an important part of this chapter, and then Chang Da will go into highlighting some of the specific recommendations that we jointly made. Can I have this next slide, Chang Da? So first of all, this session or this chapter is about equitable access and success in higher education. And it's important to say so what do we mean with access, and access, and what do we mean with equity and equity, and so it is about improving access and success of students from minoritized and marginalized communities. Students are minoritized and marginalized, not just students from minority groups, but also students who are part of a majority who are marginalized in different countries. So equity is basically focusing on the social justice part of this work, because access to higher education is provided by different systems. There are different mechanisms to increase access. But the part of equity is making sure that underrepresented groups in society have the opportunity to enter the system and to equally be successful in systems. And that asks for agenda setting on a national level, but also on an institutional and also on a study discipline level. So I think this was also something that was also already mentioned in the first session of the day. Equitable access and success have different meanings in different contexts. So context matters. And context is not just related to the country context, it's also related to a regional, to an institutional, and to a discipline context level. And I think that that's an important part. And I think Leonie also mentioned in the first session that there is no silver bullet. And I think with making higher education equitable and successful for different groups is understanding the worlds where students come from and understanding the context of institutions and regions and responding to that. It does need a vision to do that. It does need an intentional policy to make that work, and I think that's important. But context of Europe and context of Asia is different, and to some extent, I think it is also important to say that it is also important to look at current policy and systems, and also what has already been in place without framing it as inclusion and diversity, because to some extent systems or policy is already very much student-centered. And I think making sure that having a good sense of who is able to be to not only to have access, but also to feel belonging within a university, within a system, is equally important. I think it's also important to mention that marginalization and minoritization have different reasons, and a study of Atherton and others show that there's an economic and a political, the social, economic, and political context are often defining to what extent systems are equitable in terms of access and success. And I think the last part to mention, equitable access relates to diversity in representation, and equitable success relates to impact on inclusion. And I think, too often what we see is that there's a strong focus on diversity. While diversity, making systems diverse or making universities diverse, is the first step, because it's about the representation. But making sure that it's also inclusive needs much more intervention in terms of making sure that processes are also inclusive, that students feel represented in faculty, feel represented in the curriculum, feel that they feel that sense of belonging, feeling at home with other students. And I think that's the part that impact shows. Chang, yes, thank you. So in the chapter that we were part of, there's a part on the status quo, and I think that what you will see is that there's quite a lot of data collected on access and success, equitable access and success from the two continents, that there are different, definitely different framings of what it means. But I think the most important thing to say is what we see is that the numbers of higher education institutions in Europe and Asia will continue to grow, and in some parts expand significantly. What we also see is that education systems were never designed to accommodate the current and future diversity and participation. And I think that that's why this conversation is so important. And what we see is that the systems have been designed for certain groups in society, but with internationalization, with globalization, with upward social mobility within societies, these systems are becoming more diverse. And I think it is important to think, how can we make systems and institutional policy more tailor-made to support the success of all the diverse groups of students who will enter the system. What we also see is that policy commitment of higher education institutions towards equitable access and success very strongly. And and this is not just within the European or the Asian context, but it is also within on a national level. And even on an institutional level, you see the commitment that it also varies strongly. And I think that that's the conversation that needs to be that we need to focus on, because what does policy commitment means, and what does it need to make sure that that all groups in who are entering your system and your university are also successful enough to graduate. And so more diversity in higher education will come with a diversity of thought, skills, and perspectives. And even diverse research environments are demonstrably more creative and produce better results. And I think this is a quote from the EUA. And I think this is an interesting part. So on one hand, we're looking at the social justice part of equitable access and success. But on the other hand, there's also, well, if you would like to frame it that way, a business case to build that diversity in thoughts and skills and perspectives is enhancing better results. It's enhancing innovation in research. It's enhancing productivity. And there's a lot of research that has been done, especially in the corporate sector, on this. But it's also good to see that this is also important for the higher education sector. Having said that, it does take a lot of work and determination to make sure that equitable success and access is being achieved. So this social justice part is still a critical part of this work. And to wrap it up, if you look at the future of higher education, access in higher education, what we will see is that higher education will be intersectional, intergenerational, and international. And the part on intersectional is that it's not just about making sure that higher education is tailored toward the different communities, based on their single identities. But what we see is that students who are entering higher education, that they are that they represent layers of different identities by being a person with a migration background, a person of different genders, different socioeconomic backgrounds. So that's, I think, an important awareness. And it's intergenerational and also international. And the part on globalization and internationalization will be covered in another chapter as well. But I think that that's something to take into account. And so it is a fluid process. And what works today is probably not something that will work tomorrow. And so it is a constant process of evaluation and evaluation. So my last slide is on how can we achieve this? Well, first of all, having metrics is important. And I would make the distinction between metrics focusing on diversity, on the representation, and metrics for inclusion. And I think that those two groups of matrices are important, because we do want to know to what extent is higher education a representation of society. But on the other hand, we also want to know, is that representation also visible in the impact? And with impact, I would say that's, for instance, our retention, data on retention, data on graduation, data on the representation within the faculty, the representation within students who continue for their PhDs or postdocs. All those metrics are important. When on a national or on an institutional level policies are developed, there are different strategies that are interesting, and I think I want to focus on four. This is part of a European project that I was a part of, the multi-include, and I included the link. And there are 4 C's. I already mentioned how important context is, but it's equally important to focus on coherence, commitment, and content. And so the part on coherence is that all different interventions on a national and on an institutional level, they have to communicate with each other and to be coherent in their message. And also, I mean, nothing on this part on equitable access and success. It is not possible if there's no commitment on different levels within institutions, on a national level, on a regional level, because institutions operate in a regional level with city councils, with other stakeholders, with different organizations. So that's important. And of course, the content of education and the content of the curriculum is also an important part in that.
Great. Just aware of the time?
Yes. I make my last 2 points and then I'll finish. Wesley, thank you. So in terms of innovation, it is also interesting to see how higher education institutions can collaborate with students to develop inclusive policies and practices. There's an initiative from the Dutch government in collaboration with ECHO, my organization, that have been working on this. And the last part, and that was also already mentioned in the first session, what works for Europe is not necessarily effective for Asia and vice versa. Thank you so much. And I hand over to Chang.
Thank you, Mary, for bringing us through the current situation as well as the status quo of equitable access and success in higher education, both in Asia and Europe. I'm now going to talk through the next session in our chapter. That is what we couch as spotlights. These are opportunities, these are risks that we have identified, as well as it comes together with some of the recommendation, both at the system level as well as at the institutional level. So the first spotlight that we have sort of bring together is the need to focus on students and inclusivity in thinking about equitable access and success in higher education. The second spotlight is generational differences in opinion and attitude. The third, equitable access and success in times of disruption. And the fourth spotlight is the need and the importance of data in terms of informing this context on equitable access and success in higher education. The first spotlight itself. The first spotlight, as we see that higher education expands, as we Mary rightly pointed out, and it has been shown in a lot of data from the chapter. Not only the higher education is expanding, completion rates and achievement levels at elementary and secondary school has also increased tremendously across all countries. And therefore, higher education would then receive a more qualified group of people that are more diverse with different backgrounds coming into higher education. And that would have implications on that whole consideration of what is equitable access and success. These wider group of people with different representation could be from the marginalized and minority groups, will bring with them not only different form of identity as they go into higher education, but they requires a different approach to education and learning. They carry with them very different cultural practices. And importantly, as has been talked a lot about in the first session, is the affordability and why these people goes into education, higher education. Is it driven by an purely economic consideration, or is there a wider educational purposes in terms of going to higher education? And therefore, the need to actually focus on a more diverse group of students, to be mindful of their affordability and their out-of-university support in terms of defining what is success. So it's not sufficient to just bring in a more diverse group of students into higher education, but it's also to ensure that they have been given the right support that leads to success in terms of at the time where they leave the university. And at the system level, the recommendation that we have put forward for this is for policies at system level to be mindful and to embed different multiple perspectives, especially students from the minority and disadvantaged backgrounds. And the second is to commit to a holistic view of higher education and the importance and outcomes and benefits that comes together with access and success in higher education. At the system level, there's also a need to manage contribution of the private sector, and especially to ensure that the quality is not being compromised for the sake of inclusivity. And the fourth recommendation at focusing on students at the system level is really, there's a need for high-level policy commitment, a continuous policy commitment to equitable access and success. And at the same time, for institutions, the spotlight has also is equally important for consideration, and 3 recommendations has been put forward to ensure that the right focus is on students and inclusivity at the institutional level. And the first is to recognize distinctive categories of learners and to provide additional support accordingly to the different groups of students, and not to assume that everyone who walks through the university doors is the same. So to recognize the diversity and to be inclusive in terms of providing the kind of support. And the second is really to identify, examine, and put in place good practices, particularly in teaching and learning activities, as well as to foster an inclusive environment within the university. And the third recommendation at the institutional level is to look at providing opportunities for students to shape institutional approach to strengthening equitable access and success in higher education.
Maybe 5 more minutes.
Yep, thank you.
Thanks, Chang.
The second spotlight, as we have also talked about in the opening, where Professor Zoe was commenting about the generational differences between himself and also Ms. Zamzam as well. And we need to be mindful that there are generational differences, especially from general differences between policymakers, institutional leaders, academics, as well as the students itself. What may work for the previous generation or in the minds of the previous generation may not necessarily be what the current generation of students would want, and also in terms of their opinions and their attitudes towards approaching higher education. And therefore, at the policy level, consideration should be given to create platform for high institutions to engage with students, academics, and leaders across different generations. But more importantly, in this spotlight is the recommendation for institutions, because this is where all the action is supposed to take place. There's the need to really prioritize and to recognize and celebrate generation differences, to recognize that, and to also develop flexible programs of study with flexible modes to address different needs of not only a more diverse group of students, but also a different generation of students going into higher education. And this is to ensure that we are able to capture the wider benefits of going into higher education. And last but not least on this is also to ensure that curriculum remains inclusive and relevant to the current generation of students. The third spotlight is talking about disruption. I think we are all confronted with this COVID-19 pandemic. It has brought tremendous disruption to higher education, but we are also mindful that the COVID-19 pandemic is not the only disruption that is being confronted by higher education. In many different countries and systems, they are confronted with disruptions in the form of natural disaster, wars, and even technological advancement can bring about disruptions to the whole practice of higher education. And therefore, a key consideration in this is for policy and at the system level to ensure that equitable access and success, its objectives and funding are integrated even in the situation of disruption. And let's not let the progress that has happened to be dwindle away just because of the disruption that comes into higher education. And at the institutional level, is similarly, there's imperative that disruptions do not hamper progress, and institutional initiatives that is intended to support access and success remain at the core of whatever institutional initiatives in the times of disruption. And the last but not least, the fourth spotlight is the need for collection of data, comprehensive data, for us to understand and to monitor equitable access and success, because without sufficient data, this will be a barrier, because we will all be talking in terms of assumptions and hearsay rather than tangible data that can show us to show us and to guide us in terms of how to introduce more targeted and effective policies and initiatives at the institutional level. And therefore, at the system level, our recommendation is there's a need to examine the data collection system in terms of integration, its effectiveness, and its efficiency of data gathering across the different parts of the higher education system. And at the institutional level, to collect the data that enables understanding of the background of students and their experiences journeying through higher education within what is culturally and legally permissible in each context. And with these four highlights, we sum up this chapter that we had on equitable access and success. And we also want to take this opportunity, not only Mary and I were involved in this, there are also four other colleagues, Dr. Dina Afriendi, Dr. Graham Atherton, Dr. Rihat Rias, and Mr. Martin Hammerberg, who has been collectively authoring this chapter on equitable access and success. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mary and Chang. I hope everyone gives a big round of applause from wherever you are watching, because I feel like this was such an inspirational talk. You really anchored this debate, not just so that we're aspirational, but that we're informed, that we're practical, the good data that's needed to make this a practical approach. And Mary, I feel like you really challenged us on these points about marginalization and being minoritized, and how equity is making sure that underrepresented groups have access to be successful. Truly important, and I hope we can dive deeper into these topics. Chang-da, addressing different needs, how we understand that at different levels. I think there's a lot to unpack, and the audience has come forward with many, many questions. So we have about 25 minutes for your questions, and I hope you keep sending your ideas and questions, comments, links. We want to keep this discussion going. And I'll just kick it right off, and I'll read you about 2 or 3 questions and invite Mary and Chang-da to respond. Our first question for Mary, from Nabarajav, Perusilami, and 2 people, that's what it was, Ramiro and Batista, Ramiro Batista. Can we equate equity with success? So really a square question. What do we mean by equity and success? And so how can we turn each other's technical divide in this pandemic to ensure equitable access for all? That question for Mary. Question for Chang-da from Sheila. What can school and higher education educators do to further advocate for reforms in policy and services for greater diversity and inclusion in the student body? So talking about the advocacy needs for reforms and policy. And Mary, if you're up for it, I'd throw in one more question on how can marginalized groups be better incorporated into higher education, kind of linking that onto your first point. I'll start with Mary.
Yeah, thank you so much, Wesley. Can we equate equity with success? I think that's a great question. I think it is yes and no. Yes, we can equate equity with success, because equity is not just about entering the system. It is also about being successful in the system. On the other hand, but I think what is most important is whether it is access or success. It is about making sure that everybody is able to enter, despite where you come from, where you were born, what if you were the first in your family to go to higher education. And I think those are things, and I think it is a very contextualized part, because in different contexts, being marginalized means something different. But it also challenges us and the systems to look at our own reference chart and also the lens that we're looking at each other. So it is about being bold, but also being vulnerable and being, talking about inclusion can also be a very rosy kind of conversation. But it is also about making sure that you're intentional in providing systems that take the lived experiences of many others that are probably not the lived experience of many people who are already shaping the system and the policy. So I think that's important, and I wish that equity is equal to success, because that's at the end of the day what we would like to achieve. And I think the second question was to what extent is equity also achievable within the current pandemic, right? Well, I think the interesting part is that the pandemic showed how diverse and how marginalized some groups are. And but it wasn't there. It just, I mean, it made it more visible, but it was there already. And I think what I hope is that it only created a higher sense of urgency, that working on these issues is something that we knew already, and the data in the report is already showing it. But I think the pandemic gave us another reason to realize that in a current situation like the pandemic, not having technological support is really a very difficult. Is even more difficult to join your classes. Not having computers or having a laptop, you know, all little practical things made it even more presence, and so that's that part. I hope that I have answered it well. And your last question was
maybe for Chang, we can ask him to come in on the second question about what school and higher education educators can do to further advocate for the reforms needed at these different levels to promote diversity and inclusion.
Thank you very much, Wes. Thank you, Sheila, for that question. I think it's a pertinent question. What's the role of educators, both at the schools and at higher education? This really goes back to some of the fundamental discussions we have as a group in preparing for this chapter. That is the need to also understand the different aspiration of people going into higher education. There is much more than just saying that going to university is or higher education is a good thing, but there is also a huge cultural dimension, differences in terms of family background, in terms of cultural background, and also differences in terms of expectation of the society, for example, in all this. But nonetheless, it's important for us to, first of all, recognize that as educators, especially in schools, is to instill the aspiration and to give the right understanding of what are the important purposes someone, if given with the opportunity to go into higher education, and how higher education can play its part to shape the development of the human person, not only just for economic consideration. I mean, nonetheless, it's still an important lever of higher education, of moving people out from poverty, social mobility. But nonetheless, is to recognize all these differences, but to give the inspiration and the aspiration to the students to go into higher education, especially those coming from disadvantaged background, coming from the marginalized, or perhaps parents who have never even gone to university, the first generation, to give them that right perspective. And as educators within the institution, this is where the action happens. And I think educators needs to be mindful, needs to refocus on accepting every student as unique individuals. And that's the reason why we couch the first spotlight as the need to focus on the students. I think the student-centeredness must be at the core of practices at the institutional. We need to recognize the diversity of learners before us, not to assume that everyone is the same in that sense. They have with them very different mindsets, very different approaches. And especially for those coming from disadvantaged backgrounds, from marginalized groups and minority groups, going into university can be a very, very different experience to someone who's perhaps from the middle class and who both parents were already who have been to the universities and so on and so forth. And as educators, I think there's a real need to appreciate that diversity and to tailor that accordingly. But in terms of, I think, advocacy for reforms at the policy level, perhaps is something that is a little bit more challenging from educators' point of view. But I believe that as individuals, educators, dealing with the individual students, to have that as an appreciation of the diversity is really key.
That's beautiful. And I love how it connects on, Mary, your point earlier about being intentional about lived experiences. Mary, you made some wonderful points, and I just wanted to elaborate on this next question as we get into the different dynamics and how to intervene. The question for Mary from Mohammed Shariat Ullah, actually in Bangladesh. Fantastic. Please include your country name so we can reference you. From Shariat. How can we secure equal access to unaffordable academic content? So some equitable issues in terms of access to academic content from Mary. Chang from Keegan Teo, is everyone deserving of equitable placing in society? This is a provocative question. What do we mean by that, and how come it's not been achieved? The question then is, what are the parameters that are being set to ensure that marginalized communities are being proportionally represented in legal policies? That is a big question. Chang, I'll throw you another one from Dr. Doris Padmimi. And some countries offer scholarships and grants to international students, speaking to your background in internationalization. So this is good. There are barriers in the form of immigration restrictions or banks being blocked, some very practical realities about access. How do we reduce these barriers to international and global education opportunities to ensure equitable access to education? Thank you, Dr. Doris. And we'll start with Mary on Shariat's question.
Yes, thank you for the question. How can we secure equal access to unaffordable academic contents? Well, what we see is that often universities, selective universities, also have like have funding schemes to make sure that students can afford to enter. And so the focus is very much on merit. But I think it is important to be aware of the fact that students who cannot afford often have a different social capital, different cultural capital, and often don't see themselves going to these universities. So creating equitable access starts even before going to university, and it's also about empowering students to see themselves, and aspiring students to see themselves going to these universities. And I think on the other hand, and that also relates to one of the previous questions, it is not just important to empower students, but also faculty within universities who are experiences different, who have to communicate with different groups from society. That's also something that needs to be addressed, and that's, I think, one of the biggest issues where universities are also struggling with. So it is a multi-layered question, and I think so it begins far before higher education and should be nurtured during education. And I really want to stress that providing financial support is not enough to enter these unaffordable academic contexts.
Really great points to widen the complexity of that question. Thank you, Mary. I'll pass to Chang Dao.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Kagan, for that question. I think I would not go into the philosophical debates about whether Marxism or socialist or the economic capitalist idea of education should be the key. But I think the SDG 4 itself has clearly outlined the commitment of education for all. And I believe that education for all is not just about going to schools, but it also includes anyone who wants to go into higher education deserve to be there. It's based on choice, not by it's a right of the individual to pursue education and knowledge, and that extends towards even beyond schools, but into higher education as well. As for, I think, but the bigger question is also balancing that view of getting more people to university for the sake of education or the sake for economic purposes. As rightly pointed out by Professor Zhou in the opening session, right? The economic imperative of education has overtaken the more important discussion about why we want people to go to higher education. And the economic imperative has therefore leave us with a problem. Student debts, is it worth to go to higher education? Because we are solely evaluating this from a dollar and cents perspective. And worse still is we are using the narrative that to get a job at the end is the reason you go to university, to go into higher education. And if we go with that if we stick to that economic imperative of wanting people to go into higher education, and therefore that needs to be carefully reconsidered. And are the policies that wants a greater group of people from diverse background going to university for that same reasons, I think that needs to be reconsidered and to be carefully rethought. The whole neoliberal idea of higher education is a problematic, and it's a problematic concept that would distort that what we can think about higher education from an educational perspective, from a social perspective, in terms of going to higher education as a lever of social mobility, for example. The development of the human person to be able to not only respond to economic challenges, but also respond to cultural, social challenges of the person and his or her community in that sense. And if we go with that thinking, I think then there is definitely a need for that, and policies needs to be mindful of that. And that's why it all comes back to, do we get the right aspiration put into people going to higher education? As with Dr. Doris' question on immigration barriers and things like that, I know very well the context that she brings with her. Unfortunately, these are some of the barriers that is beyond higher education systems and institutions to address. Because in almost every country, immigration is the more important policy, and usually in most contexts, national security is the utmost important consideration, and it's very frustrating for higher education to deal with that. I have to acknowledge that. I personally know cases of individuals who were going through hardship due to those restrictions. But I strongly believe that that should not be a hindrance for us to continue to talk about equitable access and success. And let's not let those barriers be to stop us from being more inclusive, but to perhaps think about ways to go around it. And the COVID actually provided us quite on the one hand, it's a problem, but on the other hand, it also gave us a reason to think, because, for example, international students don't need to come in now because of travel restriction. We see international students are registering with institutions around the world. They don't necessarily travel. So perhaps that is some thoughts that how we could continue to leverage on some of the restrictions we're going through now, and to think about how can higher education become to address those issues of inclusivity and giving the support for success.
Outstanding. And I think, again, connecting back to Mary, your point about that providing funding is not enough. Providing incentives financially is not enough. What do we want to achieve holistically by promoting mobility? If it's not in line with national policies, national immigration policies, then we're saying and doing something different at the same time. It's the green light, red light challenge. So how to deal with that complex issue of equitable access. And I think that touches back to the opening session about this humanistic vision that is needed, what Chang, you call this aspirational vision that we need to continue to revisit and challenge. UNESCO promotes a humanistic approach to education and development. So I'm curious from both of your views if you see some of the same themes in your research as you went through both Europe and Asia. And another, again, to challenge our thinking about the full extremes of our lived experiences, UNESCO does have a mission to promote peace. So I'm interested how you see conflict or education in emergencies. We are seeing this very actively in Asia and the Pacific in some countries. So what can we learn about equitable access in these challenging times, whether from the pandemic or other education and emergencies? So there's two questions. Chang, would you like to start?
Right. Thank you, Wes, for that. I think this, as we have pointed out in the third spotlight, the disruption is not just the COVID-19 pandemic. Wars, natural disasters are equally pertinent disruptions. And the whole question about peace and what's the role of higher education in that. I think what is important is not to be distracted by the disruptions on the more important agenda of ensuring equitable access and success. And definitely education is a key avenue for promoting peace and understanding. Cultural differences, intercultural differences, and understanding the intellectual minds who are able to discuss and debate rather than using force of violence, for example, are some of the characteristics of what education is supposed to do. And these are the more humanistic values and benefits of education that is frequently not talked about if we take on a very economic-driven lens to look at higher education. And therefore, it's extremely important to develop the overall peace and understanding within a society, to have a diverse group of people who goes to university and to engage in that from an education point of view. The understanding and that is definitely key to peace and sustainability, in my view. Perhaps Mary may want to add.
Yes, and thank you for this question, Wesley. It is we live in a time where so much is happening in the world, and focusing on the humanistic element is beautiful, but we can't do that without having conflict. And I think people who are doing this work on equity and access and success are dealing with conflict on a very micro level, because you have to constantly debate and make sure that there is this humanistic vision is there, even though it not necessarily appeals to your frame of reference. And I think it is, and whether it is driven by a socioeconomic background, generational background, or it is constantly to what extent can you relate with others that are not part of your peer group, of your upbringing. And I think that that's something, so it comes back to the fact that it's often on a very personal level, that it starts with the personal level. If you can understand and relate to what is necessary for you or your children or your family members, that can also be relevant for others in society. And I think so the part of conflict, and Zul, Professor Zul also in the first session mentioned, the different social movements that we are seeing, Black Lives Matter, Asian Lives Matter. So these are developments that we didn't orchestrate it with policy or practice, but are happening, and students and people are standing up in society, and in fact holding each other accountable, holding each other accountable. And I think so, apart from what we can do with policy, there's also nowadays, due to technological developments, there's also other voices and other movements that we have to take into account, and are also influencing our own minds, how we deal with different conflicts and contexts. But yes, and I think the most important part of the humanistic element is being aware of the different narratives, whether it is students or faculty, policymakers, everybody, because this is a multi-layered aim, and with many stakeholders, but making it very personal and very and to relate on this humanistic level is so important.
Thank you very much. We're coming to the end, but I do want to end on this beautiful point and this important point of our united humanity as a point of departure for that aspirational vision. Chang, any last thoughts as we close this session, building on Mary's points there and the wonderful contributions of all experts, before we give a big round of applause to you and Mary and the experts?
Yeah, thank you. I think the key message coming from the groove is that what works in Europe don't necessarily works in Asia, and actually there is the further to that is the need to treat each context as unique, and the need for every system to think carefully for itself within that system what it means to have equitable access, and what it means for each institution within that system and context to support the students towards achieving the success in the forms of a true higher education. I think that is key in what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. You've aspired, inspired, and assured us. And I think it's an important session and contribution. So again, thank you for your contributions today, and to our audience. We had more questions that we couldn't answer. I want to acknowledge your contributions. I acknowledge that we couldn't answer all your questions, and we thank you for those invitations and your contributions today. Over to Miguel. Thank you for that wonderful session, everyone.
Thank you very much, Dr. TETER, Mary, and Chang. Thank you so much. We will now have a 5-minute health break. For our ASEM policymakers who wish to continue our chapter with our discussion with our chapter experts in the closed-door policy dialogue, please visit on the event platform, the agenda section on the conference platform, and select the closed-door session on Chapter 1. For our public audience, we invite you to attend the next session of the conference. This focuses on Chapter 2 of the ARC8 Outlook Report 2030 on inclusive teaching and learning in a digital world. If you're on the conference platform, please visit the agenda section and select the session for Chapter 2. If you're joining us from YouTube, simply stay tuned to this YouTube live stream. Last but not least, for those participants who wish to receive a certificate of attendance, the letter for our ARC8 anagram is a letter U. U for Ulan Bator, the capital of Mongolia. Thank you again for your time.